A wildfire, a baby left to die, and a man who risked everything to save her. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Let's get started. The sky above Pine Hollow, Colorado was a furious orange. Flames roared through the forests, devouring everything in their path. Thick smoke choked the air and the heat was unbearable. The town was in chaos, people shouting, cars honking, and the sound of crackling fire everywhere. Jake Torres, a 41-year-old mechanic with calloused hands and a worn-out face, hurried to pack his pickup truck. His dog, Rusty, barked nervously in the passenger seat. Jake's mind raced. He grabbed a few essentials, a toolbox, some clothes, and a photo of his ex-wife he couldn't bring himself to throw away. As he slammed the truck door shut, a faint cry cut through the noise. Jake froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a baby. "Rusty, stay," Jake muttered, his voice rough but firm. He followed the sound, his boots crunching on the dry, burning ground. The cry led him to a small cabin, its roof already smoldering. Without thinking, Jake kicked in the door. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. He coughed, covering his mouth with his shirt. And then he saw her, a baby girl, no more than a year old, lying in a crib. Her tiny face was red, her eyes watering from the smoke. A leaking pipe above had soaked her clothes, but she was alive. Jake didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, grabbing a nearby diaper bag with one hand. The crib creaked as the flames licked closer. Just as he stepped outside, the cabin groaned and collapsed behind him. He ran to his truck, the baby clutched tightly against his chest. Rusty whined as Jake placed her gently on the seat. "Hold on, little one," he said, his voice softer now. "We're getting out of here." The Red Cross shelter in Denver was packed, families huddled together, their faces tired and scared. Jake sat on a folding chair, the baby girl asleep in his arms. A volunteer had given her a clean blanket and a bottle, but no one knew who she was. "You said you found her in Pine Hollow?" a social worker asked, her pen poised over a clipboard. Jake nodded. "In a cabin. No one else was there. Just her." The social worker frowned. "We've checked with everyone from Pine Hollow. No one's missing a baby. The cabin's owners were out of town for weeks." Jake glanced down at the baby. Her tiny hand gripped his finger, and for a moment he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A flicker of hope. The diaper bag held only the basics: diapers, formula, a few clothes. No name, no note, no clues. Fingerprints on the bottle were sent to the lab, but with the wildfire's chaos, results would take weeks. "We're overwhelmed," the social worker admitted. "Foster homes are full and we're stretched thin. Could you look after her for a few days, just until we figure this out?" Jake hesitated. He wasn't a father. He wasn't even good with people. But as he looked at the baby, her big eyes staring up at him, he couldn't say no. "All right," he said gruffly, "but just for a few days." Jake's small apartment wasn't exactly baby-proof. Tools and car parts cluttered the living room, and the kitchen was a mess of takeout containers. But he did his best. He bought a second-hand crib from a thrift store and set it up in the corner of his bedroom. The first night was rough. Mia, he'd started calling her that after finding the name stitched into her blanket, cried for hours. Jake paced the room, feeling completely out of his depth. "What do you want, kid?" he muttered. Frustrated but determined, by the third night he'd figured out her routine. She liked being rocked to sleep, and she loved the sound of his guitar. Jake hadn't played in years, but he dug it out of the closet and strummed a few chords. Mia clapped her hands, her laughter filling the room. Jake couldn't help but smile. "Guess you're my little Sparky," he said, the nickname sticking. But it wasn't all easy. Flashbacks of his divorce haunted him. His ex-wife had wanted kids, but Jake had been too scared, too closed off. Now here he was, caring for a baby he didn't even know. One evening as he fed Mia her bottle, he found himself talking to her. "You're a tough one, aren't you? Survived a fire, got me wrapped around your little finger." Mia gurgled, her tiny fingers reaching for his face. Jake felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for her. But somehow, she was exactly what he needed. Jake's apartment slowly transformed into a home. The old crib he'd fixed up stood proudly in the corner of his bedroom, and the living room now had a playpen filled with colorful toys. Mia's laughter became the soundtrack of Jake's days, a sound he never knew he needed. One evening, Jake sat on the couch, strumming his guitar. Mia, now a little over a year old, clapped her hands and giggled every time he hit a chord. "You like that, huh?" Jake said, a rare smile breaking through his usual gruffness. He played a silly tune, making up lyrics about Mia being his little Sparky. She squealed with delight, her tiny feet kicking in excitement. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Jake had no idea how much work a baby could be. Diapers, feedings, and sleepless nights tested his patience. One night, after Mia had been crying for hours, Jake sat on the floor beside her crib, exhausted. "What do you need again, kid?" he muttered, running a hand through his messy hair. Then, as if on cue, Mia reached out and grabbed his finger. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Jake froze, staring at her tiny hand. For the first time in years, he felt a connection, a bond he couldn't explain. The locals in Pine Hollow started calling them the Fire Duo. At first, Jake brushed it off, but deep down, he didn't mind. He even started taking Mia to the diner on Main Street, where the waitresses doted on her, and Jake found himself chatting with people he used to avoid. 9 months after the fire, Jake was at his garage, tinkering with an old engine, while Mia played nearby with a set of plastic tools. The bell above the door jingled and a man walked in. He was slickly dressed, with sharp eyes that darted around the room. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, wiping his hands on a rag. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for my niece. Heard you might know where she is?" Jake's stomach dropped. He glanced at Mia, who was happily banging a plastic wrench on the floor. "Your niece?" The man pulled out a photo of a woman holding a baby. "Her name's Mia. My sister went missing a while back, and I've been looking for her ever since." Jake studied the photo. The baby looked like Mia, but something felt off. The man's hands were twitchy, and Jake noticed a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, a strange symbol he couldn't place. "I'll need proof," Jake said, his voice steady but his heart racing. The man's smile faded. "She's family. That's all the proof you need." That night, Jake was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. He rushed to the living room to find a brick on the floor and a note tied to it. The message was short but chilling. "Give her up, or burn again." Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat on the couch, Mia curled up beside him, and stared at the note. Who was this man? And why was he so desperate to take Mia? The next morning, Jake called his old friend Officer Ramirez. They met at a quiet diner, away from prying ears. "You think she's connected to a trafficking ring?" Ramirez asked, his voice low. Jake nodded. The guy had a tattoo, some kind of symbol, and he didn't seem right. Too nervous, too pushy, Ramirez sighed. "There was a bust a few years back, a ring that snatched newborns from hospitals. The leader had a similar tattoo. If Mia's one of those kids..." Jake's chest tightened. He looked at Mia, who was happily munching on a piece of toast. She deserved to know where she came from, but more than that, she deserved to be safe. Over the next few days, Jake dug deeper. He found out the woman in the photo had died under suspicious circumstances. Her name was Lisa, and she'd been linked to the trafficking ring before her death. One evening, as Jake tucked Mia into bed, he whispered, "I don't know where you came from, kid, but I'm not letting anyone take you." Mia reached up and patted his cheek, her tiny hand warm against his skin. Jake felt a surge of determination. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Mia was his now, and he'd do whatever it took to protect her. Jake knew they couldn't stay in Pine Hollow. The threat was too real. That night, he packed a bag with essentials: diapers, formula, a few toys, and some cash. He strapped Mia into her car seat, her wide eyes watching him with curiosity. "We're going on a little trip, Sparky," Jake said, trying to sound calm. But his hands shook as he turned the key in the ignition. They drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Jake kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following them. He took back roads, avoiding highways where they could be easily spotted. At a gas station in the middle of nowhere, Jake filled up the tank while Mia slept in the back seat. He noticed a black SUV parked across the street, its engine running. His heart raced. Were they being watched? Quickly, Jake grabbed a wrench from his toolbox and slipped under the SUV. He loosened a few bolts on the fuel line, just enough to cause a leak. By the time the traffickers realized what was wrong, Jake and Mia were long gone. Over the next few days, they moved from town to town, staying in cheap motels and camping in remote areas. Jake used his mechanic skills to create diversions, slashing tires, disabling engines, and even setting off a car alarm to draw attention away from their hiding spot. Mia, oblivious to the danger, brought light to their journey. She laughed at Jake's silly faces, babbled in her car seat, and clung to him whenever they stopped. One night, as they sat by a campfire under the stars, Mia pointed at the sky and said, "Daddy, moon." Jake's heart swelled. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for her, but in that moment he knew he'd do anything to keep her safe. The traffickers finally caught up to them at an abandoned quarry on the outskirts of Denver. Jake had thought it would be a safe place to hide, but he was wrong. The black SUV screeched to a halt, blocking the only exit. 3 men stepped out, their faces hard and determined. Jake grabbed Mia and ran, his boots slipping on the loose gravel. "Give us the kid and we'll let you walk away," one of the men shouted. Jake didn't respond. He ducked behind a stack of old tires, his mind racing. He had one advantage. The quarry was filled with old machinery and fuel drums. "Stay here, Sparky," Jake whispered, setting Mia down in a hidden nook. He grabbed a flare gun from his truck and a can of gasoline. Working quickly, Jake poured gasoline around the area, creating a trail that led to a pile of debris. He lit the trail with the flare gun and ran back to Mia just as the flames erupted. The explosion was deafening. The traffickers scattered, shouting in confusion. Jake used the chaos to carry Mia to safety, his heart pounding in his chest. As they reached the edge of the quarry, police sirens wailed in the distance. Officer Ramirez and his team arrived just in time, arresting 2 of the traffickers. But the leader, the man with the tattoo, was gone. Jake and Mia were taken to a safe house, a small cabin tucked away in the mountains. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt like he could breathe. Officer Ramirez visited a few days later with news. "DNA tests confirmed it," he said. "Mia has no living relatives. The woman in the photo, Lisa, wasn't her mother. She was part of the trafficking ring." Jake looked at Mia, who was playing with a stuffed bear on the floor. "What happens now?" "You'll need to testify against the ring," Ramirez said. "And if you want to keep her, you'll have to fight for custody." Jake didn't hesitate. "She's my daughter," he said firmly. "I'm not letting her go." Over the next few weeks, Jake worked with lawyers and social workers to make it official. He attended court hearings, answered endless questions, and proved he could provide a stable home for Mia. One evening, as he tucked Mia into bed, she looked up at him and said, "Dada, home." Jake smiled, his eyes filling with tears. "Yeah, Sparky, we're home." The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Jake sat in the front row, dressed in a suit he hadn't worn in years. Mia, now 3 years old, sat on his lap, her tiny hands clutching a stuffed bear. The judge looked over the paperwork, then smiled at Jake. "Mr. Torres, it's clear that you've provided a loving and stable home for Mia. It's my honor to grant this adoption." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He looked down at Mia, who was staring up at him with her big, curious eyes. "We did it, Sparky," he whispered. As the judge finalized the paperwork, Mia suddenly pointed at Jake and said, "Dada." The room erupted in applause. Jake's eyes filled with tears as he hugged Mia tightly. Officer Ramirez clapped him on the back, and even the judge smiled. For the first time in his life, Jake felt like he belonged. Mia was his daughter, and nothing would ever change that. Jake and Mia moved to a small town called Cedar Ridge, where Jake opened a garage called Torres Auto Repair. The town was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names. Mia thrived in their new home. She followed Jake around the garage, her tiny hands clutching toy tools as she helped him fix cars. Customers loved her, often bringing her little gifts like stickers or candy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mia turned to Jake and said, "Dada, I love you." Jake's heart swelled. He pulled her into a hug, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, Sparky, more than anything." As the stars came out, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed. Mia had brought light into his world, a spark that had ignited something he thought was lost forever. Years later, Jake received a letter in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, but the name caught his attention. Sarah Mitchell. He opened the letter, his hands trembling slightly. "Dear Mr. Torres, my name is Sarah, and I believe I'm Mia's aunt. My sister Lisa was forced to give Mia up under terrible circumstances. I've been searching for her ever since. If you're willing, I'd like to meet her. And you?" Jake read the letter twice, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. Mia was his daughter, but she deserved to know where she came from. That weekend, Sarah visited Cedar Ridge. She was a kind woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile. Mia, now 7 years old, was shy at first but quickly warmed up to her. Over dinner, Sarah explained everything. "Lisa was my sister. She got caught up with the wrong people, and they took Mia from her. She tried to get her back, but she didn't make it." Jake listened quietly, his heart aching for the woman he'd never met. Sarah reached across the table and took Jake's hand. "You've given Mia a life full of love and safety. You're her father, and nothing will ever change that. Mia looked at Jake, her eyes wide. You're still my dada, right? Jake smiled, his voice steady. Always, Sparky, always. The visit ended with hugs and promises to stay in touch. As Sarah drove away, Jake and Mia stood on the porch, watching the sunset. Dada, Mia said, leaning against him. Yeah, kiddo, I'm glad you're my dada. Jake wrapped an arm around her, his heart full. Me too, Sparky, me too. If this story got you inspired, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.